The faded photograph remains in the Philadelphia Museum archives, showing Marcus Coleman and his business partner Alexander Wright smiling on the deck of a steamship in 1882. What makes this image so haunting isn't just that it captures the two men weeks before Wright's mysterious disappearance, but that it documents the beginning of one of America's most intricate revenge plots. The handwritten note on its reverse, discovered only decades later, reads, "The debt begins today." Over the next 15 years, Coleman's empire would crumble piece by piece through what appeared to be a series of unfortunate coincidences, until historians uncovered evidence that Wright's orphaned daughter had orchestrated his complete destruction from the shadows. Before we continue with the story of how 19-year-old Catherine Wright transformed herself into an architect of ruination, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments which state you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to America's Gilded Age, when fortunes were built on ambition, ruthlessness, and often the destruction of those who stood in the way. Marcus Coleman wasn't born to privilege. The son of a Baltimore dockworker, he arrived in Philadelphia in 1865 with nothing but raw intelligence and an almost supernatural ability to identify profitable opportunities where others saw only risk. Post-Civil War America was transforming rapidly, and Philadelphia stood at the crossroads of old money and new industrial power, the perfect environment for someone willing to operate in the gray spaces between legitimate business and outright fraud. By 1875, Coleman had established himself as a rising star in Philadelphia's shipping industry. What separated him from countless other ambitious young men was his extraordinary talent for creating the appearance of integrity while practicing none of it. He cultivated a public persona of Christian charity and family values while systematically exploiting everyone who trusted him. This duality made him particularly dangerous to someone like Alexander Wright. Wright was Coleman's opposite in many ways. Born to moderate wealth, he had inherited his father's small but respected shipping company, Wright Maritime, which had operated along the eastern seaboard since 1832. Where Coleman saw business as warfare by other means, Wright viewed it as a community responsibility. He paid fair wages, honored contracts even when they became disadvantageous, and refused to engage in the bribery and political manipulation that characterized much of Philadelphia's commerce. Business conducted honorably benefits everyone, Wright often told his daughter Catherine during their evening walks along the Delaware River. The moment you sacrifice principle for profit, you've already failed, regardless of what your ledger shows. This philosophy had served Wright Maritime well for decades, creating loyalty among employees and clients that allowed the company to weather economic downturns through shared sacrifice rather than layoffs and broken promises. By 1880, however, this approach was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in Philadelphia's changing business landscape. The introduction of steam-powered vessels had transformed shipping economics, requiring capital investments beyond what family-owned companies could easily manage. Larger conglomerates were systematically absorbing or destroying smaller competitors, and Wright Maritime found itself struggling against rivals who didn't share Alexander's ethical constraints. It was during this vulnerable period that Marcus Coleman approached Alexander Wright with a partnership proposal that seemed almost miraculous in its timing. Coleman Shipping had recently secured exclusive contracts for coal transportation along the eastern seaboard, contracts that required more vessels than Coleman currently controlled. Rather than purchasing additional ships, Coleman suggested a partnership that would utilize Wright Maritime's respected fleet and experienced crews. The proposed terms appeared extraordinarily generous. Wright Maritime would retain operational independence while gaining access to guaranteed cargo contracts worth triple their current revenue. In exchange, Coleman would receive a 30% share of the increased profits and Wright's expertise in managing complex shipping operations. "I'll be honest, Alexander," Coleman said during their initial meeting at the Philadelphia Merchants Club. "There are larger companies I could approach, but they lack your reputation for reliability. My clients insist on punctuality and accountability, qualities your company has demonstrated for decades." This appeal to Wright's professional pride, combined with genuine concern for his employees' futures, overcame his initial reservations about Coleman's business practices. After weeks of careful consideration and detailed contract negotiations, Alexander Wright agreed to the partnership in January 1882. For the first 6 months, the arrangement functioned exactly as promised. Wright Maritime ships carried Coleman's contracted coal shipments, revenues increased dramatically, and Alexander found himself believing that perhaps his approach to business wasn't obsolete after all. The photograph in the Philadelphia archives was taken during this honeymoon period, capturing the two partners during an inspection tour of shipping facilities in Boston. What Alexander couldn't know was that the partnership had been designed from the beginning as an elaborate trap. Coleman had indeed secured the coal transportation contracts, but with terms that were financial suicide for any company that actually fulfilled them. The contracts specified delivery schedules that were barely achievable under ideal conditions and imposed ruinous penalties for delays. More critically, they fixed transportation rates for 5 years during a period when operational costs were rising rapidly due to new safety regulations and increased competition for experienced crew members. Coleman had never intended to fulfill these contracts himself. His plan was to transfer the liability to Wright Maritime, wait until the inevitable financial collapse, and then acquire his partner's company for pennies on the dollar while maintaining his own operations profitability. It was a strategy he had successfully executed twice before with different partners, though on a smaller scale. The trap was sprung in September 1882, when Coleman announced that he needed to travel to England to secure new business opportunities. Before departing, he transferred operational responsibility for the coal contracts entirely to Wright, presenting this as a demonstration of trust in his partner's superior management abilities. 2 weeks later, Alexander Wright disappeared while returning from a late-night meeting at Coleman's office. His body was never found, though his hat and walking stick were discovered near the Delaware River docks the following morning. The official police investigation concluded that he had likely fallen into the river accidentally, possibly disoriented in the heavy fog that had blanketed Philadelphia that night. Catherine Wright, Alexander's 19-year-old daughter, rejected this explanation immediately. "My father knew those docks as well as he knew our home," she told investigators. "He could navigate them blindfolded, let alone in fog. And he never would have walked that close to the edge. He always said that respect for the water meant keeping a proper distance." Her concerns were politely dismissed. Catherine was, after all, just a grieving daughter, and a young woman at that. What could she possibly know about the circumstances of her father's death or the complexities of his business arrangements? Marcus Coleman attended Alexander Wright's funeral with an appropriate display of sorrow, offering public condolences and private assurances that he would help guide Wright Maritime through this difficult transition. "Alexander was more than a business partner," he told the gathered mourners. "He was my friend, and I consider it my Christian duty to ensure that his legacy continues." Within a month, Coleman had installed himself as de facto manager of Wright Maritime, claiming that the partnership agreement gave him authority to protect his investment. His first decision was to honor Alexander's commitment to the coal transportation contracts, despite growing evidence that they were financially unsustainable. By December 1882, Wright Maritime was hemorrhaging money. The punishing delivery schedules resulted in constant penalty payments, while fixed transportation rates failed to cover rising operational costs. When captains and crews complained about dangerous working conditions created by the accelerated schedules, Coleman accused them of disloyalty to Alexander's memory. Catherine watched the systematic destruction of her father's company with increasing desperation. Having been raised in the business, she understood exactly what was happening, but found herself powerless to intervene. As a woman, she had no legal authority over the company despite being Alexander's sole heir. When she attempted to question Coleman's decisions, he gently but firmly suggested that her grief was clouding her judgment. "Business decisions require a certain emotional detachment," he explained during one particularly heated confrontation. "Your father understood that, which is why he established our partnership. He wanted someone who could make the difficult choices necessary for the company's survival." By February 1883, Wright Maritime was technically insolvent. Coleman, presenting himself as the company's savior, offered to purchase Catherine's inheritance for 20 cents on the dollar. A generous offer, he assured her, given the circumstances. Faced with complete ruination, Catherine appeared to surrender. She signed the documents transferring her ownership to Coleman, accepted his token payment, and disappeared from Philadelphia society. Most assumed she had gone to live with distant relatives, her story becoming just another example of how quickly fortunes could reverse in America's volatile economy. Marcus Coleman certainly believed he had seen the last of Catherine Wright. Having successfully absorbed Wright Maritime into his growing business empire, he systematically erased all evidence of the Wright family's contribution to the company. Ships were renamed, long-serving employees dismissed, and corporate records altered to suggest that Coleman had founded the operation himself in the 1860s. By 1885, Coleman Shipping had become one of Philadelphia's largest maritime operations, with Marcus himself ascending to prominence in the city's social and political circles. His annual Christmas charity ball became the highlight of Philadelphia's social calendar, reinforcing his carefully constructed public image as a benevolent business leader. What no one realized, what Coleman himself wouldn't discover for many years, was that Catherine Wright hadn't actually left Philadelphia at all. She had simply transformed herself from a visible society daughter into an invisible instrument of justice, operating from the shadows with a patience and precision that would have made her father proud. The truth about Alexander Wright's death had come to Catherine through Mary Sullivan, a cleaning woman who worked evenings in Coleman's office building. On the night Alexander disappeared, Mary had stayed late to prepare for an important client meeting the following day. From her position in an adjacent room, she overheard an argument between Coleman and Wright, an argument that ended with sounds of struggle and a heavy thud. Terrified, Mary had hidden in a storage closet until all noises ceased. When she finally emerged, the office was empty, but a corner of the expensive carpet had been hastily rearranged, and dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood marked the floorboards beneath. Mary didn't immediately connect these observations to Alexander Wright's disappearance. Only when news of the missing businessman spread through Philadelphia did she realize what she might have witnessed. Fear kept her silent initially. Mary was a widow supporting 3 children, and her job at Coleman's building provided their only income. But as weeks passed and Catherine Wright publicly questioned the circumstances of her father's death, Mary's conscience overcame her fear. She approached Catherine secretly, sharing everything she had seen and heard that night. Her testimony, while not legally actionable given Coleman's growing influence with local authorities, provided Catherine with something far more valuable than potential prosecution: absolute certainty about her father's fate. "He killed him," Catherine wrote in a journal later discovered among her possessions. "Not in passion or desperation, but as part of a calculated business strategy. My father's death was simply another transaction to Marcus Coleman, one with favorable projected returns." This knowledge transformed Catherine's grief into something coldly purposeful. If justice couldn't be achieved through official channels, she would create her own form of accountability. Not a quick revenge that would flare and fade, but a methodical destruction as carefully planned as Coleman's own machinations. "He believes the matter concluded," she continued in her journal. "He believes I am destroyed and forgotten. This misconception will become the foundation of my response." Catherine's first step was to secure resources for what she recognized would be a years-long campaign. Using the meager payment from Coleman for her father's company, she established herself in modest lodgings in a working-class district of Philadelphia under the name Catherine Wells, her maternal grandmother's maiden name. She then sought employment as a clerical worker at the offices of Peterson and Hammond, a law firm that handled minor matters for Coleman Shipping. Her position gave Catherine access to information without attracting attention. In 19th-century Philadelphia, female clerical workers existed in a strange professional limbo, present in business environments but socially invisible. Male executives and attorneys discussed confidential matters freely in their presence, assuming that women lacked both the interest and capacity to understand complex business operations. This underestimation became Catherine's greatest advantage. While organizing correspondence and maintaining appointment schedules, she systematically gathered information about Coleman's business practices, identifying his vulnerabilities, dependencies, and most importantly, his secrets. "Coleman's success relies on 3 pillars," she wrote after 6 months of careful observation. First, his public reputation for Christian charity and business integrity. Second, his exclusive shipping contracts with Hamilton Coal and Iron. Third, his political relationships with Councilman Edward Barnes and Judge William Hartnett. Remove any one, and his position weakens. Remove all 3, and everything collapses. Catherine's campaign began with the least protected of these pillars: Coleman's business relationship with Hamilton Coal and Iron. Through her clerical position, she had learned that these supposedly exclusive contracts included secret provisions allowing Hamilton to utilize other shipping companies if Coleman failed to maintain certain performance standards. More importantly, she discovered that Coleman had been systematically falsifying shipping records to conceal delays and quality problems. Rather than exposing these falsifications directly, Catherine employed a more subtle approach. She created anonymous letters to Hamilton executives highlighting specific shipments where their product had arrived damaged or delayed, providing enough verifiable details to establish credibility without revealing her identity or methods. Simultaneously, she cultivated a relationship with James Wilson, a junior accountant at Hamilton who handled verification of shipping documentation. Through carefully orchestrated accidental meetings at a church charity group, Catherine established herself as a sympathetic friend to whom Wilson gradually revealed his professional frustrations, including his suspicions about Coleman Shipping's reporting practices. Catherine encouraged Wilson to implement more rigorous verification protocols, ostensibly to protect him from professional liability. "You've mentioned these discrepancies to your superiors 3 times without result," she noted during one conversation. "If problems eventually become impossible to ignore, they'll look for someone to blame. Better to have documentation showing you raised appropriate concerns." Her subtle manipulation achieved exactly what direct accusation could not. By late 1886, Hamilton Coal and Iron had begun quietly diversifying its shipping arrangements, reducing Coleman's share of their business by nearly 30%. While not catastrophic, this reduction significantly impacted Coleman Shipping's cash flow and created operating inefficiencies as vessels that had been dedicated to Hamilton's predictable schedules now required more complex logistics to remain profitable. Catherine's journal entries during this period reveal her methodical thinking. This first phase achieves 3 objectives. It reduces his immediate income, complicates his operations, and most importantly, creates a problem he cannot easily identify or address. He knows something is happening but cannot determine what or why. This uncertainty will drive him to make mistakes as he searches for explanations. The second phase of Catherine's campaign targeted Coleman's political relationships, connections that had protected him from regulatory scrutiny and provided advance information about government contracts and policy changes. Rather than attacking these relationships directly, she focused on making them more costly for Coleman to maintain. Through her clerical position, Catherine had learned that Coleman's relationship with Councilman Barnes involved monthly payments disguised as consulting fees for Barnes' brother-in-law. Using anonymous letters similar to those sent to Hamilton executives, she provided the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer with documentation of suspicious timing between these payments and council votes favorable to shipping interests. The resulting newspaper investigation didn't directly implicate Coleman. Catherine had carefully ensured the evidence wasn't that specific, but it created enough public concern about corruption that Barnes and other council members became much more cautious about their business relationships. Barnes doubled his expected payments from Coleman, while simultaneously becoming less reliable in delivering favorable outcomes. Similar subtle pressures were applied to Coleman's relationship with Judge Hartnett, though through different channels. Catherine discovered through office conversations that Hartnett's son had accumulated substantial gambling debts that Coleman had quietly settled in exchange for favorable rulings. Rather than exposing this arrangement, Catherine anonymously ensured that Hartnett learned his son had resumed gambling and was telling associates about how certain arrangements would take care of his obligations. The judge, terrified of scandal that would destroy his reputation, immediately distanced himself from Coleman and forced his son into a private sanitarium in New York. Coleman thus lost another protective relationship without ever understanding why or how it had happened. By 1889, these subtle attacks had significantly weakened Coleman's business position and increased his operating costs, but Catherine recognized they represented merely preliminary steps in her larger strategy. To truly destroy Marcus Coleman as he had destroyed her father required attacking the foundation of his success, his carefully constructed public reputation. This phase required more direct intervention than Catherine could execute alone. She needed allies who shared her interest in exposing Coleman's true nature, but who could operate in social and business circles from which she, as a female clerical worker, remained excluded. She found her first significant ally in Thomas Bennett, a former ship captain who had served Wright Maritime for 15 years before being dismissed by Coleman during the company's absorption. Bennett had subsequently struggled to find comparable employment, his reputation tarnished by Coleman's suggestions that he had been terminated for incompetence rather than cost-cutting. Catherine approached Bennett carefully, arranging an accidental meeting at the boarding house where he had been reduced to living. She initially presented herself simply as Alexander Wright's daughter, seeking connections to her father's former world. Only after establishing trust over several months did she gradually reveal her true purpose and the evidence she had accumulated regarding Coleman's responsibility for her father's death. Bennett required little persuasion to join her cause. "Your father was the finest man I ever sailed for," he told Catherine after learning the full story. "He treated every man on his ships like family. What Coleman did to him, and to all of us who depended on Wright Maritime, that's not business. That's murder and theft dressed up in a fine suit and calling itself progress." Through Bennett, Catherine gained access to a network of former Wright Maritime employees who had similarly suffered from Coleman's takeover. Many now worked for competing shipping companies where they could gather information about Coleman's operations that complemented Catherine's knowledge of his financial and political arrangements. This expanded network allowed Catherine to implement the next phase of her strategy, systematically undermining Coleman's operational reliability. Bennett's contacts among active ship crews facilitated subtle forms of sabotage, not enough to endanger vessels or crews, but sufficient to create delays, increase operating costs, and damage relationships with clients. Cargo would be incorrectly loaded, requiring time-consuming rearrangement at destination ports. Maintenance issues would be discovered just before scheduled departures. Administrative errors would result in vessels arriving at ports without proper documentation, causing delays and customs penalties. Each incident appeared accidental when viewed in isolation. Collectively, they created a pattern of unreliability that gradually eroded client confidence in Coleman shipping. By 1891, the company had lost nearly 40% of its regular business, though Coleman himself remained uncertain about exactly why his once thriving operation was faltering. He searches for conspiracies in the wrong places, Catherine noted in her journal. He suspects his competitors, his partners, even his own managers, everyone except the invisible woman who sorts his mail and schedules his appointments. I sit in his outer office 3 days each week, watching him grow increasingly desperate as everything he built crumbles around him, and he looks through me as if I don't exist. The final phase of Catherine's campaign represented her most audacious strategy. Having weakened Coleman financially and operationally, she now moved to deliver a killing stroke to his public reputation, the foundation of his remaining business relationships and social position. Through her years working at Peterson and Hammond, Catherine had methodically collected evidence of Coleman's numerous fraudulent practices. Falsified shipping manifests, bribes disguised as consulting fees, insurance claims for non-existent cargo losses, and most damaging of all, documentation of unsafe vessel operations that had resulted in preventable crew injuries and deaths. Rather than taking this evidence to authorities who might still be influenced by Coleman's remaining political connections, Catherine orchestrated its public exposure through multiple channels simultaneously. Key documents were provided to 3 different Philadelphia newspapers, ensuring that no single editor could suppress the story. Additional evidence was sent to business partners, social connections, and church leaders who had long accepted Coleman's public persona at face value. The resulting scandal erupted in November 1895, 13 years after Alexander Wright's death. The Philadelphia Sentinel's headline captured the public sentiment: Coleman Empire built on fraud, respected businessman implicated in years of systematic deception. The evidence was too overwhelming and came from too many sources for Coleman to effectively refute. Business partners dissolved their relationships, banks called in loans, and social acquaintances publicly distanced themselves from the man they had previously celebrated. When criminal investigations began, many former associates rushed to make deals with prosecutors, providing additional testimony about Coleman's fraudulent practices in exchange for immunity. Marcus Coleman's final public appearance occurred on December 10, 1895, as he departed the federal courthouse following his indictment on 37 counts of fraud, bribery, and tax evasion. Photographers captured his haunted expression as he pushed through a crowd of former friends and business associates who now stared at him with undisguised contempt. That evening, Coleman returned to his increasingly empty mansion on Philadelphia's prestigious Rittenhouse Square. His wife and children had already relocated to relatives' homes in Boston, attempting to escape the scandal that had destroyed their social standing. Servants had departed as their wages went unpaid, leaving the once imposing residence silent and cold. According to police reports, Coleman spent his final hours writing letters, apologies to family members, pleas for understanding to former friends, and practical instructions regarding his few remaining unencumbered assets. Shortly after midnight, he took his own life with a revolver that had been a gift from Judge Hartnett years earlier during happier times. The official narrative of Marcus Coleman's downfall attributed his destruction to the inevitable exposure of long-standing fraudulent practices. Financial experts described it as a textbook case of unsustainable business operations finally collapsing under their own weight. Social commentators viewed it as a morality tale about the consequences of placing appearance above substance. No one connected the systematic destruction of Coleman's empire to Catherine Wright, who continued working at Peterson and Hammond for another 6 months before quietly resigning her position. The clerical worker who had sat in Coleman's outer office for years, witnessing his growing desperation while methodically orchestrating his destruction, simply disappeared from Philadelphia without fanfare or notice. Her journal, discovered decades later in a trunk sold at auction in Boston, provides the only complete account of what she herself described as the longest business negotiation in history, the full repayment of my father's stolen life. The final entry, dated January 15, 1896, reveals that Catherine viewed Coleman's suicide with neither satisfaction nor remorse, but rather as the closing of accounts. The debt is settled. Not through the quick violence he visited upon my father, but through the slow, methodical dismantling of everything he valued. He experienced the complete destruction of his business, his reputation, his family relationships, and finally his hope. Exactly what he inflicted upon others throughout his life. My father believed that business conducted honorably benefits everyone. Marcus Coleman proved the corollary. Business conducted dishonorably eventually destroys everyone it touches, including those who practice it. The difference is merely one of timing. Catherine Wright never returned to Philadelphia. Historical records indicate she eventually settled in Chicago under her mother's maiden name, establishing a small but successful investment firm that specialized in assisting women managing inheritances or divorce settlements. She never married, though she maintained close relationships with her godchildren and supported numerous charitable organizations focused on educational opportunities for women. She died in 1942 at the age of 79, having witnessed America's transformation through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Her obituary in the Chicago Tribune described her as a pioneering businesswoman known for her exceptional integrity and patient approach to financial matters, a fitting epitaph for someone who had demonstrated those qualities in ways her contemporaries never fully understood. The story of Catherine Wright's methodical revenge represents something more profound than simple retribution. It illustrates how power operates in complex social systems, and how those dismissed as powerless may create influence through patience, observation, and strategic thinking. In an era when women were systematically excluded from business and legal authority, Catherine created alternative pathways to justice that utilized rather than challenged the very limitations meant to constrain her. This remarkable case shows us that sometimes justice operates on a different timeline than we expect, working quietly through the same systems that initially facilitated injustice. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe and the notification bell to hear more dark historical mysteries in our next video. Leave a comment letting us know which aspect of Catherine's revenge you found most impressive: her patience, her strategic thinking, or her ability to remain invisible while orchestrating such elaborate justice. I'll be reading your thoughts in the comments section.